The best two words to use what just happened with McLaren team, even though they finished 1 and 2, is incompetence and unprofessionalism. The McLaren team have now finally finished 1 and 2 with what is now the fastest car in Formula 1, and they've achieved something that they haven't gotten since 2021 with Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris. But the drama that ensued during this Hungary GP just made everything so much worse over a result that should be celebrated in a very big way. This was definitely the sassiest Grand Prix of the year. It felt like we were watching a Kim Kardashian drama show with the amount of radios going on, a furious Max, and not one, but 2 different driver swaps that were very controversial to say the least. So many teams made errors on the pit stops and the strategy, so we gotta talk about the race recap as a whole. This is definitely about McLaren and how they ruined Oscar Piastri's first win, and I do think the team mentally is gonna have to take a look at this GP and think back what we could have done differently. If you guys do enjoy the video, please give it a like and subscribe. Your guys' support means the world, and it means a lot for the channel. It pushes me forward and helps me make better videos for you guys. So let's get into the Hungary GP review pretty much. We already had a pretty fun Saturday in qualifying with a 1-2 in the front with McLaren and a chasing Lion Max Verstappen in P3. On the formation lap, we had drivers with mediums, some in hards like George Russell and Perez, who were starting from behind the grid, and the Aston took a gamble on some softs. It was a very hot day over there in Hungary, so we knew this was going to be at minimum a 2-stop. At the start, Oscar gets a better start than Lando, which seems to be the common theme now. Lando doesn't really have that great starting ability as of right now, especially in P1. I don't know whether it's due to pressure or the other drivers just having that over him. Max also got a great run from the outside, but in Hungary, while turn 1 is pretty wide, it's not wide enough to have 3 cars. So we see Max go off the grid, already giving us some drama in the beginning because he ends up overtaking Lando, who stays in P3 after getting it back from Lewis, who overtook him at some point after turn 2. We then go on to lap 3, where Max is still in P2, even though it was an illegal overtake, and the team is now telling him, hey, maybe you should give the position back. We then go on to lap 4, where Max does end up giving back the position, so he doesn't get the penalty. It was very reluctant for Max, and I could tell that he didn't want to do it, and most people were thinking the same thing. And if it was his choice rather than the team's, he probably would have went on it and got the 5-second penalty. But at the end of the day, this was probably the smarter choice considering that Red Bull car is much slower than we all thought it would be here. We then get our first drama radio message with Max talking about you can run people off the track. He has a history of that. Even though I love the guy, we do know Max as the king of doing that. So it is pretty funny to hear him talk about it nowadays, considering the way that these GPs have been. Very close, and the racing has been right to the point that Formula 1 is fun. On to lap 7, we see the soft runners like Alex Albon and the Aston Martins start to make their pits with the exception of Lance Stroll. This then gives us that race classification at lap 10. Oscar is leading the race, Norris is about 2.6 seconds behind, and I have to add, Oscar in this first stint was fabulous. From start to finish on high fuel, it does seem like his race pace is getting better, and I will definitely have to note that for the next predictions because Oscar is making the changes. This was going to be a big GP to determine whether he's gotten better or not. It does seem like he's gotten better. From the back of the field, George Russell and Sergio were actually making some places up, trying to get in points paying positions, which they do end up making by the end of the race. So I guess you can say it's an impressive drive by the two, but not really considering the cars that they're in. These top 4 cars are much faster than any of the other cars behind the top 4. Oscar makes about a 3.5 second gap by lap 13, which is just quite impressive. But then around lap 17, we see our first pit stop from the top 4, which is Lewis, who gets a 2.3 second pit stop for Mercedes to try and undercut Max in P3. Then on lap 18, McLaren responds with Norris going into the pit stop, which then ends up getting him ahead of Lewis, so they successfully closed off the undercut. Piastri then pits around lap 20, which gives Max the lead, but we do know that Oscar is still leading if we go off of the pit stop race and strategy. They kept Max out all the way till lap 22, which put him about 7 seconds behind Lewis. He was definitely not a fan of this strategy plan, and this is already the second moment in the race that's going to make Max just that much more mad and already start seeing red. By lap 25, the classification is still a 1-2 for McLaren. Then we got Lewis. Then we have a charging Max who is catching up to Lewis, and Leclerc is actually being steadily behind. From the bottom 10, there is a battle between the pit stops. Aston Martin is now catching drivers, Stroll especially because he stayed out for a longer period of time, and Fernando finally made a pass on Hülkenberg after being behind them for a good amount of time. Now by lap 32, we got Max breathing on the neck of Lewis, and it seems like this pass will happen whether Lewis wants it or not. There's a couple of attempts, but nothing too serious, but on lap 36, that's when we see Max throw it up slightly on the inside, but then go back to the outside, which was a brilliant move and got Lewis off of the racing line, causing him to lock up, giving Max a better run into turn 2, getting ahead of him, and Lewis pretty much concedes the position, but considering what's been happening with the RB20, huge understeer. He braked a little bit too late going into this corner, so Lewis does end up overtaking him, giving Lewis still that P3 position. This fight keeps on roaring on for a long period of time up until we get to the next set of pit stops. But in the meantime, Leclerc is following close behind. On lap 42 is when we get Hamilton and Leclerc. Ferrari pulled a brilliant strategy move actually pitting Leclerc very early on after that stint, which was much shorter than Max and Lewis's, but it ends up giving them the undercuts both for Lewis and for Leclerc on Max, and this is another one of those points that Max gets mad at. And I don't blame the guy. It was definitely on Red Bull making the wrong calls for Max, but he was definitely very angry. It was around this point in the race that Lando actually made the deficit go from 5 seconds to 2 seconds, which we ended up seeing way later on in the race that Oscar went off somewhere around turn 11, which lost him about 3 to 4 seconds on Lando, giving Lando a chance to actually win this race. But here's where the drama ensues and where McLaren pulled off so many wrong moves, and it's going to be talked about for a while now. On lap 46, they chose to pit Lando, who was in P2, over Oscar, who was in P1, to defend Lewis, who was about 10 seconds behind. There was no threat here. They could have gone for a slow pit stop, and still, both Lando and Oscar, even if they double stacked that at it, would have gotten ahead of Lewis. There was no reason to make the call to put in Lando, which then resulted in an undercut in lap 48, and this is where the drama now continues and it enrages. On lap 49, literally the next lap after, Piastri runs it wide in turn 12, going straight onto the gravel, still keeping control of the car, but this is definitely not going to help out the tires and your overall driver confidence going into turn 12. I'm sure the team didn't even really communicate to Oscar what the plan was, because then to Lando shortly after they say, to your convenience, you can give up the position. What a joke to say something like this to a driver who you pitted first, rather than making the smart decision and giving Oscar the victory that he deserves, but putting Lando in a position where he has to make the awkward, okay, I have to let you through at some point. Max then again goes for another overcut opportunity, trying to get the better tire advantage. They did seem to have the pace when they had the tires, but they didn't have the tire life to be able to overtake cars with the proper strategy. We then saw Max go super hard straight out of the pits, catch up to Leclerc very quickly, and we already saw that GP made a joke talking about that he was burning his tires off right away. He makes that move pretty easily into turn 1 on Leclerc, but it seemed like that was going to happen from the start. It was Lewis who was going to give him more competition. We then get some messages, which is Oscar is pitted, he'll likely come out just behind. We'd like to reestablish the order at your convenience. As I said before, this was stated a couple of laps earlier to what we're seeing right now. Then the pit wall to Oscar says, once you get to Lando, we will swap to position, but we want to avoid Lando losing time. There was nobody they were under threat for. Maybe Max could have caught them by some miracle. The car wasn't fast enough to catch the McLaren's in the first or second stint, so I don't believe the third stint would happen either, but I guess you could put it out there that Max had an opportunity to catch these drivers. But now Lando was in front, and he was the quicker out of the two drivers in the last stint. Lando's race engineer then makes it super uncomfortable for anybody watching pretty much, but also being in Lando's position, with him pretty much telling Lando, listen what we talked about, think about all the Sundays, what we talked about in the briefing, make sure you let Oscar through, you need McLaren, you need your teammate to win the championship battle. It was so awkward for no reason, rather than somebody like Andrea Stella getting onto the radio and simply saying, Lando, move over, it's Oscar's win, let's make this easy, you will get your chance at victory very soon. This is an uncomfortable way to watch the race in my opinion, and it was super unprofessional by the McLaren crew. As Lando, you have to be selfish to be a Formula 1 driver. It's part of the reason. He wasn't saying anything wrong by saying tell him to catch up then, because truly, if Oscar wanted to win, he should have caught up. He did have the fresher tires while they were only 2 laps. That makes a big difference on a track like Hungary, where the track temperature was around 50 degrees Celsius, which is blistering hot, and the tires were running out very quickly. The gap ends up getting to about 6 seconds at some point with Lando. But before that, finally, Lewis and Max collide again for the first time in 2024, and both drivers are a little at fault here. Max went for way too ambitious of a dive bomb, so I would put Max more at fault here, but Lewis definitely turned in early. He says he didn't turn the wheel, but you can clearly see it on the onboard, and the way that he adjusts his car, that he does turn it in too quick. But the move by Max was just not on. He locked up completely, and I do think this lockup and the car overall giving himself wings like the ad commercial does probably give him damage, which results in him finishing behind both Leclerc and Lewis. I would still call it a racing incident. Nothing really to get over dramatic for. It happens, and this is a raging Max we're talking about. On lap 68, after all the messages, finally Lando lets Oscar through in what was a very unsatisfying way to end this race, if you ask me. Oscar goes on to win the race. It's a 1-2 for McLaren. Happy days for the team. Looks like that. Very fair post-interview by Lando, who I guarantee was mentally hurt by the team. But Oscar gives what was probably the weakest radio that I've ever heard from a driver that's finally won their first race in Formula 1.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Thanks for the coordination. Yeah, sorry. I made the swap a little bit more painful than it needed to be, but yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
It's hard to be excited when the team causes this much drama over a simple decision and what should have been a very easy victory for Oscar. This also reminds me of 2021 because Lando kind of had the pace over Daniel, but Daniel led the whole race, so there was no reason to actually swap the positions, and for Daniel at the time that meant more than for Lando, who would have been his first victory. Same thing for this case. Lando won his first race this year. It'll mean more for Oscar. Yes, Lando is in that championship battle. He is going to gain points on Max, and I do agree, he does need Oscar and the team to actually win this championship battle. But in the fashion that McLaren did it in, it was very poor and unprofessional, and for me, it was a displeasure to watch. I didn't like seeing this drama. It's not my favorite part of Formula 1. Oscar then talks about it. This is a day that I dreamed of as a kid, standing on top of a step of the F1 podium. Obviously, he's going to give a nice little interview at the end, but you can tell that he's a little dissatisfied with what happened, and almost as if he was blaming himself. We got to give the kid props. He had a great race. His tire management was good. Lando was also very quick, but he's got to work on that start. At the end of the day, it was a great performance by the McLarens, but what a drama ensued at GP, and not fun to watch from a fan perspective if you ask me. I hope McLaren learns off this. Their strategy has been very wishy-washy, and in the races they've thrown away victories. This could have been the same thing. If it was a different pair of drivers, this would have been a completely different outcome. Imagine asking Max to give up the position. That never would have happened. That's kind of what makes Max a beast, and this could definitely mentally drain a driver like Lando. What are your guys' thoughts? Did you guys enjoy the video? If you did, please give it a like and subscribe. It would mean the world, and peace.